Hi, I am Lisa Macintyre. I'm a textile technologist, and for most of my career, I have been dedicated to improving medical compression garments for the patients and also working with industry to help them improve their methods. About 5 years ago, I decided to shift my attentions to sustainability-related research, motivated by the huge range of problems that we have to deal with, a personal passion for sustainability, and also increasing student interest. My first sustainability project has been to develop new methods for evaluating the results of fibre fragmentation tests. At the time that we started this, there were no standard test methods, and I had the notion that visual grading scales could be the answer to making fibre fragmentation testing more accessible, much cheaper and quicker for industry, and therefore increase their use once they were standardised. And I secured a James Watt studentship for that. I've been working with Sophia Murden ever since. The focus of this presentation is about the things that are really hard to publish. I really love the concept of a museum of failure, and I do believe that progress is built on learning from our mistakes, and I think we learn an awful lot more from our mistakes than our successes sometimes. So most of this presentation is about the things that I've discovered along the journey that would be really hard to publish, but that I think are important to share. So fibre fragmentation problem is where I'm starting. And as we know, fibre fragments are released from textiles and clothing during laundry and use. And then fibre fragments are found in the environment pretty much everywhere that researchers have looked for them. So if you look at a bit of human tissue or the environment, then you're going to find fibre fragments there. Fibre fragments are among the biggest sources of secondary microplastics found in the environment, and whilst most of these are plastic, because most of the fibres we produce are plastic, we also find non-plastic fibres in the environment, and these can leach dyes and chemicals into the environment and our bodies, and the dyeing and the other chemical processes that we use in their production impact their biodegradability as well. I believe that testing for fibre fragmentation is the first step to addressing the problem. We can't design materials with lower fibre fragmentation properties unless we can measure them. We can all make assumptions based on our understanding of textiles, but as anybody who's ever spent time in a lab knows, your assumptions are not always borne out by the results of testing. So testing is really important. First test methods were focused on fibre fragmentation during laundry, and we have been working on that, but also on in-use testing, and we're preparing a publication for that at the moment. Since we started working on this, we've had test methods released. So ASTM, ISO and DIN have all published standard test methods for wash testing between 2021 and 24, and all of these use roto-wash type devices. The ASTM and ISO methods recommend gravimetric methods to measure fibre fragmentation. So we're taking wash liquor, filtering it onto filter papers, and the fibre fragments are caught on that, and then we weigh them. Talk a bit about that. And then the DIN standard, the original one, recommends counting using a dynamic image analyzer. And then the most recent one, in December 24, recommends grading using a 5-point visual scale, which we are really delighted about because we think that's the most effective method. So gravimetric methods involve accurately weighing the filter paper before and after filtration. That sounds like a simple and quick thing to do. It is not. It is incredibly time consuming. We have to rinse the filter, dry the filter, that takes 4 hours in the oven, weigh the filter really accurately, then test the sample, filter the effluent through the filter, dry the filter paper, weigh it, and then calculate the mass of fibre fragmentation shed. So the absolute quickest you can do this is 9 hours. And if you're doing it by conditioning the filter papers, then that will spread over a couple of days. We also have, the results are really problematic because when you rinse the filter papers to get the before weight, the filter papers lose weight. So we are reducing the mass of fibre fragments that are reported. Fibre fragment mass coming off textiles is often just a few milligrams or fractions of a milligram, which is low. It's going to be measured at the very limits of the scales, especially the scales that are recommended as the baseline for the standards. And then any differences in the measurement are going to introduce errors as well. So I'm going to show you some data. The data in the red box is using the standard accuracy scale that is recommended in the ASTM and ISO standards. And the numbers highlighted in red are the ones that are really problematic. So when we put no fibre fragments onto the filter paper, but we rinsed it, they lost weight. And not only did they lose weight the first time, but they carried on losing weight for every 5 of the subsequent measurements, which we did separately, with peak mass loss at 3. So even pre-doing it wouldn't account for this error. When we seeded effluent, so that in our first tests, what we did was take known numbers of fibre fragments, put them into water, and then filtered them so that we could measure that under known circumstances for this first test. So when we took 95 2mm fragments and poured them into the water through the filter, we got a 0 result. Even though we could visibly see the fibre fragments on the filter paper, the weight that was recorded was 0 on the standard scales. And that is problematic because it could lead to greenwashing, essentially, where you say there's 0 fibre fragmentation, but clearly there's not because we can see it. More accurate scales are much less problematic in terms of the results that they deliver, but they are incredibly sensitive to placing this filter on different areas. And because the pans for these sensors are much smaller than the filter papers, theoretically we shouldn't be using them. So we probably need new balances being made. Counting fibre fragments is incredibly time-consuming and much less accurate than we had anticipated. So when we're counting fibre fragments, we are photographing the filter paper, overlaying it with a grid, and counting representative samples. But as you can see from the image on the top right of the screen, they don't distribute evenly. So depending which filter squares you pick to count, you're going to get very, very different results. Manual counting is extremely time consuming. So for the squares around the edge that have hardly any fibre fragments, you could be looking at just a few minutes. But for the ones with very dense fibre fragmentation, that can be 20-25 minutes per person. And you want to take the average of at least a couple of people. Any crossed fibres, fibre clumps, marks on the filter paper make the counting harder and introduce errors. And then we have to question, what does the count even tell us? Because long fibres are eventually going to break down into short fibres, and one long fibre will break down into multiple short fibres. So what does knowing the number of fibre fragments actually tell us? You talk to people about this and they immediately say, well, what about machine counting? Surely that'll fix it. And the DIN standards recommend the dynamic image analyzer, which we don't have in our lab, but we've used other digital counting methods. And we spent about 3 months on this in our own lab, looking at different filters through different threshold settings, different pieces of software. This is an example of some of our results. We couldn't get so what this shows is the little bars show the manual counts, the error margins for the manual counts. And you can see that the manual counts with 3 different observers were fairly close together. The dots represent the machine counting using different threshold settings. And you can see that you get a massive range of numbers of fibre fragments depending on the threshold setting that you pick. And that's because if you reduce the gain, then the one fibre will show as multiple fibres. No single threshold setting worked for all the images, and they swapped positions. So the triangle setting, little green dots, was the highest one for all of them. So you could discount that one really easily. But the other ones were much closer and kept switching position. We couldn't do this, and we're not computer scientists, so we involved an MSc mature student who'd been a programmer for 20 years and his supervisor, and they spent 3 months on this as part of a master's project. And although they did marginally better than us, they did not solve it, and they couldn't get a single threshold setting that would work for the sample images that we had. So we're really suspicious of the counting method. So that brings us back to a grading scale method, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with this. But this is the grayscale, which is used for measuring colour fastness tests. It's about 50 colour fastness tests used in the industry. It's one of the most commonly used quality control tests in the industry. The top scale there shows a 5-point scale used for measuring fading of samples, and the one at the bottom is for staining of adjacent fabrics. And this scale, like all the other visual scales used in the industry, are 5-point scales where 5 shows no change in the sample and 1 shows a big change. And generally speaking, the industry standard acceptable change, the pass mark, if you like, for quality control purposes, is normally a grade 4. There are other scales for different tests available. So we developed one for fibre fragmentation. Actually, we developed about 8 for fibre fragmentation and evaluated them and eventually optimized them for small numbers of fibre fragments. We did this by taking known numbers of fibre fragments and making our scale, and then we repeated that for replicate test specimens. So we did lots and lots of these specimens, 3 replicates for each, and we took the average grading of observers as our test score, similar to the methods that are currently used in industry. And what we found and were not surprised by was that it was really quick. It was therefore really cheap to do, and that makes it much more accessible to industry because testing costs money. So if you can make that quick and cheap and easy to do, then it's much more likely to be adopted by industry. What we didn't expect when we set out on this was that it was going to be more accurate than the gravimetric method and more accurate and reliable than the counting methods. We assumed that our method would be worse, but most of the scales that we tried, once we'd got good at making scales, were better, gave lower variability. And the data that you want to look at for that evidence is the coefficient of variation numbers. So the low coefficient of variation numbers for the 4 different observer sets, particularly at the low fragmentation levels, which would be the likely pass-fail decision points, if you like, are much lower than the scale method, the objective method, which we would normally naturally be predisposed to trust using. And that the mass ones shown there are the minimum standard that is recommended by the ISO standard. The coefficient of variation for the more accurate scale was less, but still higher than the observed subjective test results. So we were delighted with that. That was a success. It's the only success I'll be talking about today. But we have published that. We've discussed that with industry. We've discussed that with as many people as we could, and we've published our paper. And then we're delighted to see that the DIN spec came out in December 2024, which recommends a visual fibre fragmentation scale to assess the results. And we think that is a great idea, big step forward. So end that one on a success, and I'm going to switch now to talking about recycling. So I'm sure you're familiar with images like this, which is adapted by my fabulous research student Gigi Zhang from Potting's paper on research strategies, not research strategies, the R strategies for circularity. So despite being second from last on the R strategies, even if we do change our industry, which we haven't yet, but if we change our industry to be making long-lasting products that are really well considered in terms of making excellent choices at the design stage, and then we extend the life of these products using reuse and repair and all of the other strategies R3 to R7, we will still at some point have to recycle those materials when they're no longer reusable in order to avoid them being dumped or incinerated. Closed loop textile to textile recycling is preferable to open loop, but doesn't currently exist at scale. Current estimates are less than 0.1% of fibre produced is textile to textile recycled. and that's often sort of rounded up to less than 1% of textile being fibre-to-fibre recycled. I do apologise for the grass cutting going on outside my office. So very little has been published on textile-to-textile thermal mechanical recycling, despite the fact that more than half of textiles are melt spun. So colleagues Valeria Irigi and David Bucknell, who are polymer chemists, and I managed to recruit a student, Zara Standring, PhD student, to investigate this. And because more than half of the textile fibre filament produced annually is polyester, that seemed like a very good place to start our investigations. So our attempts, as with all good PhDs, started with a literature review and then moved on to lab scale testing. I mean, other PhDs exist, but lab one, we moved on to lab scale shredding and re-extrusion, which was much more challenging than any of us anticipated. We thought we were going to romp through this and quickly get to a place where we could be optimizing it, and but the extrusion was incredibly variable. The getting it to draw was really, really challenging. And so we then went back and examined our like supervisors' background, so my textile knowledge, my colleagues' polymer knowledge, and did a deep dive into related literature, given the paucity of literature on thermomechanical recycling, and also had loads of conversations with the industry for the challenges. And there's a slide on each of these bullet points, so I'm going to get straight into that. So the first reason why fibre-to-fibre recycling of polyester is really challenging is because of the allowable tolerances on fibre content labelling, which is not just a problem for the label, it's also a problem for the message that sends to industry and has sent for years and years. If you add all of the allowances together, you get up to 16% allowable variation from the fibre content label. So a textile or a garment that is labelled as 100% polyester could have as little as 84% polyester in it and still be perfectly in compliance with the legislation. Now, regardless of the technical justifications, the legal tolerances, or the very good reasons why that might be necessary in industry, to the recycler, that difference between what it says on the label and what is actually in the textile is massively problematic. So we've got a 16% allowable tolerance on the labels, but less than 1% elastane content can render the material unrecyclable. A maximum of 3% non-polyester tolerance on extrusion, and that includes the dyes, detergents, and non-polyester content which may occur in the material. There's a report by Circle Economy that I suggest you take a look at that found that 77% of garments with pure content had a difference between what the sorting technology, the NIR or the FTIR, said, and the NIR, in this case FibreSort, and the fibre content label. And there's lots of reasons for that are properly explained in the report. But basically, pure textiles will always be more recyclable than mixed, and that is where we need to get to. And pure meaning pure. And I'll talk about that again in a minute. So we have collection and sorting challenges. Only around a quarter of textile waste is separately collected. The rest goes into general waste, and that's a rough estimate. Collected textile waste is typically manually sorted into garment type and colour, and the primary focus on that sorting is on reuse. The profitability of sorting is increasingly challenged due to the low quality of collected textiles and saturation in the second-hand market. Sorting for recycling relies on label information, which, as we've seen, is often wrong or missing, and also on the scanning technologies, which is near or Fourier transform infrared scanning, which is around 95% accurate for pure fibre content. Scanning accuracy is lower for blends, and scanners can only scan what they can see. So if it can't see the lining, or it can't see the facing or elastic or anything on the reverse of the garment or the underside of the garment as it passes under the scanner, then that's not going to be scanned and it's going to contaminate recycler. And then sundry items need to be cut off before recycling. And all of that adds to the cost of an already low value material. We then have the problem that garments are not currently designed for circularity. So as we know, garments are composed of the fabrics, fastenings, and then other components, things like sewing thread, ribbons, etc. And these components often are made from a wide range of materials, many of which are exempt from appearing on the label. Monomaterials make recycling much more feasible, and the variation in these components makes for challenges to the recycler. We all know that textile blends and combinations are increasingly common in our garments, but these and the unintentional contamination all complicate recycling. Not only do they increase the cost of processing and reduce the quality, they also massively increase the amount of wasted material in the recycling process. And this is something that I was really shocked by how much this can be, and is really not reported in the literature very much at all. And that is the difference in the amount of material, even once you've cut off the zips and got rid of all the things that we can't currently recycle, the difference between what goes into the recycling process and what comes out of the recycling process, that wasted material, can be very high and is hugely impacted by contaminants. Not only is that material wasted, but it can also damage the equipment and require increased frequency of changing filters, etc. And it can also make the recycling technically impossible, or make the value of the recycled material so low it's wasted, essentially. We then have things that are kind of invisible to us. It doesn't appear on the label. So most polyester that appears in textiles is polyethylene terephthalate. But these other polyesters, PBT, PTT, and PCT, which are commonly used for other polyester products out with the textile industry, do sometimes find their way into textiles and contaminate the polyester that's going through and being recycled. The more sustainable polyesters, the bio-based and the bottle-to-fibre recycled polyester, also have different properties to virgin textile polyester, and that affects the way that they are recycled. The polyester itself, even if it is all polyethylene terephthalate, that's normally composed of terephthalic acid and ethylene glycol, but sometimes contains a small proportion of diethylene glycol, and sometimes the ethylene glycol is entirely replaced by diethylene glycol, and that impacts the properties of the recycling processes. So any amendment to the polyester chemistry can impact the molecular weight and the degradation during recycling. And that is also hugely underreported or unreported in the literature. We had to pick all of this up from other papers, and we're currently trying to get that published, but we're having real difficulties because it's essentially a literature review that has been repurposed based on our experiences and conversations. We also have a lack of supply chain transparency, and the literature generally talks about the need for supply chain transparency, the absence or methods to improve it. But the lack of transparency, to me, implies that something known is being hidden purposefully, intentionally from the consumer or from downstream manufacturers. But actually, when you speak to manufacturers, they frequently don't know the source or composition of the yarns, filaments, and fibres that they've used in their garments or textiles, because we all have big jobs, limited time, and limited capacity to know everything about everything. And that means that they can struggle both to solve their own quality control issues, but also understand the impact of their choices for future recycling. So if textile-to-textile recycling of polyester is to become a commercially viable reality, then not only do we need pure fibre content, but we also need the compositions to be limited for example, only polyethylene terephthalate with limited additives currently have 18,000, an estimated 18,000 different chemicals used in the textile industry. That's the whole textile industry, not just polyester. But that massive variation needs to be reduced to give textile recyclers a fighting chance of making the best quality recycled content. So, as you'll have gathered from all of this, the solutions to solving our recycling issues and our sustainability issues are really complicated. And my kind of big takeaways, which are not, again, not rocket science, and I'm sure we all know this already, is that you can assume nothing. You can't take anything at face value. You have to dig really deep and think hard about stuff. We all know that commercial teams and academics operate under time, cost, and information pressures. Technical education and direct and open communication are really challenging, but also absolutely essential, I think, to progressing and making the best decisions for our future. And if we want change, we need to look beyond immediate financial or other gains and make some really difficult decisions. And that is not going to be popular politically, socially, economically, or anything. We need to simplify things. We need to really limit polymer compositions and the number of additives that are allowable and used in our industry. Things like what the Plastics Treaty is currently trying to do for plastics, we need that for textiles. We need to slow down, and this is not news, to allow people more time to test things, discuss things, think about things, and make good choices. We need to publish what doesn't work as well as what does, so that we can learn from other people's mistakes and really push things forward and not have every lab making the same fundamental mistakes at the very start of the process and wasting loads of time. If we could learn from others what hasn't worked for them, then we could all progress our work much more quickly, I think. We want to move away from using chemicals to optimize longevity and try to do that as mechanically as possible in order, again, to make recycling more likely. And beware the objective, going back to the fibre fragmentation thing, beware the objective. Just because it's objective doesn't make it true. And I would extend that to AI, so we haven't discussed that here. And we all know what absolute garbage in terms of information, the wide range of information from really good quality to absolute nonsense there is on the internet. And if that's what's feeding our AI, then we need to be really wary of that as well. So thank you very much for your attention. And here are some contact details if you want to contact any of us. And that's us. Thank you very much.